Um, Grace Wells, who is the Senior Director of Public Policy for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber, Brian McClung, who's the co-CEO and Senior Principal for Park Street Public, and our Master of Ceremonies today, the well-known and fabulous Tane Danger, who is the host of the Theater of Public Policy. I expect great things from all of you today, and we thank you for joining us. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Tane, and we will get on with the show. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much to the Minneapolis Regional Chamber and our sponsors for making this whole thing happen. And thank you all for being here. We have been planning this event for a couple of weeks, and almost every day we were like, oh, wow, we have an entirely new topic to talk about. And today was no different. So we have a lot to cover, and our goal today is to try and get some overview, some predictions, some crystal balling of both the big national election that's coming up, but really trying to take a look at Minnesota and what that might mean here. And we're very interested throughout the program in your questions as we kind of go from top of the ticket on down and look at a variety of different things happening. So as you have them, please send them in and we'll try and work those in as we go. But I don't want to waste any more time because we do have a ton to talk about. And I woke up this morning and had to rewrite how I was going to start this whole program, as I think that a lot of us woke up to the news that President Trump was diagnosed with COVID-19 and First Lady Melania Trump. And obviously, I want to say from the get-go that this is a medical and personal tragedy first and problem, and we are not medical experts, and there's also just not a whole lot we know at this point. I'll say I think that all of us wish the president well in wanting him to recover and not succumb in any significant way to this illness. And yet we're here at a political forum. We are 30 some odd days away from an election, so it's really difficult not to talk about this in some ways in terms of the election that's coming up. So I want to do that. I think that it's also somewhat complicated by the fact that the president seemingly potentially contracted this on a trip to Minnesota because he had an aide with him who was diagnosed with it and then was with a lot of Minnesotans. So that is a lot of setup for me to say to Brian and Grace, and I'll start with you, Brian. What do we make of this? What does this mean for these next 33 odd days of the campaign?
Yeah, well, thanks, Tane, and thanks to the Minneapolis Regional Chamber for hosting this, and all of you for tuning in. And like Tane said, our hope is to have a discussion and a debate and show that we can do that without shouting and talking over one another, and be reasonable and hopefully at times even funny. So we'll try to work that all in the course of the next 50 minutes. But I would say it's very interesting for starters. It really takes Minnesota's status as a battleground state to a new level. Right now, Minnesota is a state that pundits have been watching very closely in this election cycle. The Trump campaign has put a lot of resources and a lot of effort into winning Minnesota. I mean, this trip on Wednesday was the second trip in 2 weeks for the president. So they have been focusing on Minnesota, and now the focus is in a very unexpected way. And that is, as you were saying, the president may have been carrying the virus when he was here. And so now, the congressional delegation was traveling with the president on Air Force One. So you have 3 Republican congressmen. Some of them have been talking this morning already with the media. Congressman Tom Emmer mentioned that he was tested leading up to traveling with the president, and that he's been tested regularly over the last couple of weeks. So obviously they were taking precautions to try to avoid having this happen. Now, my concern is not so much whether the president contracted the illness in Minnesota or on the way here, how he got it, but it is who in Minnesota may have been in contact with him and then may be at risk themselves. So I think that's going to be a topic of conversation for the Minnesota media and for the politicians and people that were part of that event. And that is really just an unexpected conversation to be having 1 month before Election Day.
So Grace, I want to come to you on this. I will say my bias is I think that it is regrettable that as much about COVID became as political as it was, as much as it did. That said, that's the place that we're in. And our social medias are filled this morning with people calling out the hypocrisy of, holding big rallies and events like the one in Minnesota without masks and things like that. I kind of come to you in terms of, does this change like how we talk about this going forward? Does it sort of humble us to the fact that this disease isn't playing politics with us? I don't know. Where do we go?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really interesting question. It's going to be fascinating to see how it plays out in the next couple of weeks. And I will say, too, I mean, it's exactly what you said, Tim, when you got started. Of course, we're all wishing the president and the first lady our best. And I prior to joining the chamber, I had the unique experience of working very closely with Commissioner Jan Malcolm at the Minnesota Department of Health. So I have an incredible amount of empathy and compassion for people who are battling this virus every day and are suffering from the virus every day. But to your question, I think this is probably going to cause us to take stock in how we view campaigning over the next month. Obviously, Democrats and Republicans have been looking at this a little differently. And to Brian's point, we're in this very unique spot where we're kind of watching all of the legislators who were with the president, and I'm heartened to see that a lot of them seem to be taking these precautions seriously, and they're getting tested and they're quarantining, and I hope that continues. But yes, absolutely. I think this is absolutely a moment where we need to be taking stock of, how we've been messaging this pandemic all along, which is, at the end of the day, this is about taking care of each other. This is about taking care of our family members. And are we doing everything we can to ensure that we are keeping all of us safe?
Brian, are Republicans ready to pivot to that? And I do say pivot, and I realize it's not universal, but we've seen Jason Lewis, we've seen Tom Emmer, and we've seen other people participate in these big rallies where masks aren't around very much, people shaking hands, getting close. Does this potentially change that? Is the party ready to change in that direction?
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to watch and see how, people react to that. The Biden campaign has a big rally scheduled for this evening that I think they're still now, I believe that's in Michigan. They're planning to have an event. So now we'll see if they plan to go and do that. I think it was going to be one of their first larger type events of the campaign cycle. Republicans, I think have, the way that you've seen some Republicans behave in the campaign trail is a reflection of the fact that many of them feel like what the government did was an overreach, and that we don't know that all of those restrictions actually had an impact on the spread of the disease and what's happened. So I think that's what you're seeing. And, in our state, especially if you travel to northern Minnesota, and we've seen the polling kind of break down, northern Minnesota is very strong for President Trump. People in northern Minnesota are saying, look, there weren't that many cases here. You're shutting down our businesses, you're shutting down our livelihoods in a way that we're not going to be able to recover from. And so I think that's part of, that's the attitude that has taken root with some Republican activists. And so that's why they act, and have taken the stance that they have. That said, the virus is here, right? The virus is present. It's not going away. And you have to be smart about it. And if you're going to put yourself in those situations, you have to understand the risks that are involved.
Okay, so I'm going to slightly transition, but you brought this up, Brian, that Minnesota is a battleground state, seemingly, or at least that's how everyone is treating it. And I'm curious if you all think that is accurate, or if that is sort of like a wishful thinking, perhaps on the part of the Trump administration. So I was looking at some of these numbers, and obviously in 2016, Donald Trump came very close, closer than anyone since Ronald Reagan, I believe, in winning Minnesota. He came within about 1.5 points. But the numbers were that he got about 1.32 million votes here in Minnesota. Clinton ended up getting 1.322 million. So she just sort of eked out a win. And that would make it seem like it's competitive. But if you go back to 2012, Mitt Romney actually got more votes, I believe, he got only slightly fewer votes than Trump ended up getting. The big change was that there was about a couple 100,000 Obama voters that just didn't show up, seemingly, for Clinton, either voting third party or sitting out. So my question is, is Minnesota really a battleground state, or was 2016 sort of an odd year where just there were a lot of depressed or turned off folks who probably are Democrats or would vote for a Joe Biden, but just really didn't like Hillary Clinton, making this sort of a wild goose chase for the Trump campaign? I'll start with you, Grace, because that's fun. I imagine you have strong thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a part of what you're saying that was correct, perhaps, regarding the depressed turnout in 2016. And I personally feel like I've seen more messaging around getting people out to vote, and the numbers of people doing early voting has just completely blown my mind. So I think that is a really excellent sign. But yes, the focus on Minnesota, even before what has happened today, has just been like completely baffling to witness. In some ways, it feels like the Trump campaign might as well take up temporary residency in Minnesota for how often people from the campaign are here. And I have just personally found, the strategy lately, I think it's been in his past 2 visits that he's used the line, like, if I lose Minnesota, I'm never coming back here again. And I find that interesting because I'm not really sure how that served Republicans all that well, but it is certainly energizing Democrats. So I think in a way, the fact that there is this big national focus on Minnesota is going to be a really good thing for Democrats. And then also when you look at how Democrats are doing in Senate races and other local races across the state, Democrats are still doing incredibly well. And Joe Biden is still doing incredibly well in every poll in the state recently.
Brian, is this Lucy with the football? Is Minnesota the football? And you were advising either the Trump campaign or Republicans more broadly, would you tell them that they're making a good decision putting as many resources here as they are?
Well, I think the way they look at it is twofold. One, if Donald Trump wins Minnesota, he can lose some other states and still get the electoral college votes he needs to be president. So, you could lose maybe Florida, or you could lose Pennsylvania, which are bigger states, of course. But then if you add Minnesota's 10 electoral college votes back in and you win, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, then now you're back in the ball game. So I think it's an insurance policy more than it is a must win. So that's number one. Number two is, you mentioned that the last very close race in Minnesota was when Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale in 1984. And I think for Trump, right, Trump is about ego and about his personality. And I think if he can win Minnesota, then he can do the thing Ronald Reagan didn't do, right? And so for him, like the stature of, I won Minnesota, not even Ronald Reagan could win Minnesota, but I was the one who did it. I think there's some value in it there. So I think they have enough resources. These campaigns are not like the campaigns for president in the 1990s, where they actually had to make choices about where to spend their money. They raise hundreds of millions of dollars, over $1 billion per campaign. So now they have the resources to go and play in other states and these insurance policy states. And that's where I think Minnesota, it's a battleground. I mean, it's going to be within 5 percentage points. So it's close enough that it's in the hunt. And I think you tie that in with President Trump thinking, I'm gonna beat Reagan. Hey, there you are.
So here's a question for the folks watching at home, but I'm also going to ask it of you all, which is, Minnesota is more of a battleground this year than I've seen. Closest probably was 2004. George W. Bush really tried to make a play here. But do we like it? Is this good? Would we rather the sort of national campaigns forgot about Minnesota again? Brian?
I like it. I mean, I'm a political junkie, so I'm fine with that. And I like having the presidential candidates come and visit our state. I mean, for decades they did not, right? Because of course, Minnesota has the longest streak in the nation of voting for a Democrat for president since 1972 and Nixon. So for most of my life, no presidential campaign came here. And then we got into the 2000s and it started happening a little bit off and on. And now it's really full on. So I'm fine with it. Like, yes, you have to, mute your TV more and watch try to avoid the internet ads. But it is, I think at least it causes Minnesotans to get engaged and get involved in some way.
Yes, I mean Minnesotans. I'll just say, I'm not debating you. I'm not. It's not. You aren't Trump, and I'm not
You're
Chris
Chris
Wallace.
Wallace. Yeah, here we
Yeah,
go.
but it's like Minnesotans are very engaged already. I think we love our voting and our participation. I don't know, Grace. Would you be happy? Maybe I'll pose it. This is my crystal ball question of this round because this is a crystal ball event. If depending on how Minnesota goes this year, does Minnesota stay a battleground state in 2024, 2028?
That's a great question. And I think that kind of plays back into how much emphasis the Trump campaign has been putting on the state and how it sort of feels like one of those make or break states for them. That said, this is also the last time that Trump is going to be running for in professional politics. So, and I think any presidential campaign after this is going to be completely different. But I'm in the same boat as Brian. I'm also a political junkie. I love all of this is at least keeping watching the race a lot more interesting because there's always all those local angles. And I think, yes, you are correct that I think it's a Minnesota badge of honor that we were all incredibly engaged in our elections. But I think any opportunity now, particularly as people are voting early, anything that we can do to get messaging in the minds of voters is a fantastic thing.
What do you think? Does it stay? Do we keep? Is this the future that we have to look forward to in Minnesota?
Well, I think it depends on how the other states start to break. And so, because now you're seeing, Arizona is a swing state that's kind of trending a little bit Democratic. You see Georgia come online as a battleground state. Texas may likely be a future battleground state. So if Texas turns into a legit battleground state, then Minnesota's not a battleground anymore because Texas is so big and has so many electoral college votes that, the focus is going to be on a place like that. So I think it depends on how things go there. And then, of course, after this election, we have redistricting and we have the census, and we want to put in a plug for the census. If you haven't completed your census form, if you're dialed into this at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning, you probably filled out your census, but maybe find someone who hasn't finished their census form because it's due by the end of the month. But with that census, then we have redistricting. And then with redistricting, that's going to change the outlook for our congressional seats. We're on the cusp of losing a congressional seat. Another reason to find somebody to get involved and fill out their census form, make sure we have a complete count. But even with that, we might well lose a congressional seat. And then there's the redistricting of legislative seats and this rural metro split that we've seen in our voting and how that's going to be impacted by all of that. So we've got a lot happening over the next couple of years that I think will impact the long-term political outlook in our state.
Yes, I'm going to do an even more pointed pitch. And again, I assume everyone on this call has probably filled out their census, but if you have someone in your faith community or in your civic group that you think maybe hasn't, here's what's on the line. Minnesota could lose a congressional seat. Florida could gain one. Do you really want Florida to have a little bit more power than Minnesota? I'm from Florida. I don't want that. Minnesota should keep that congressional seat. So go fill out a census for yourself and make sure your friends do it too. Okay, let's move down the ballot. There's a Senate race in Minnesota. Didn't we just do this? We just had a bunch of Senate races, but Tina Smith is back on the ballot again for the second time in 2 years. And she's up against former Congressman Jason Lewis. I think that at least the things I've heard from Jason Lewis, he kind of admits I'm tethered to Donald Trump in Minnesota in terms of whether I'll win or not. So I'm curious. I'll start with you, Grace. Is there more to that race than whether people are going to go with Donald Trump or not? Minnesota does have some history of ticket splitting, at least on the congressional versus presidential level. So when you're looking at Tina Smith versus Jason Lewis, what is that race about?
Yeah, to your point, Jason Lewis has not shied away from the fact that he is hitching his wagon to President Trump. And I personally think that is a risky strategy. I know Trump came close to winning the state in 2016, but I think the last 4 years have, particularly in suburban districts, really changed how people are viewing him. And like you were saying earlier, I think one of the weird things about this race and what Senator Smith is facing is the election calendar is just confusing for people. Like, she just ran in 2018. I think people had a lot of emotions about that particular race, either because they were upset about Al Franken, and also it was a special election. Amy Klobuchar was also on the ballot. So it was just bizarre. And now she has had to jump straight into another race. And, you know, kind of at the front end of things was also dealing with the fact that that was when Amy Klobuchar was running for president. So that certainly took up a lot of local and national attention. And I think people are still, I mean, now that she has TV ads running, that is certainly more helpful. But I think people have just been needing constant reminders that this race is happening and this race is in play. That said, I think it is comforting to see that Senator Smith has been ahead consistently in all the polls. And I think she's been a really effective senator in the relatively short amount of time that she's been there. She has a track record of bipartisan legislation, and I think has really been getting things done that Minnesotans like.
Brian, I'm going to point out the thing that I've pointed out when you've been on my show before that you probably love, which is that you worked for the last Republican who was elected statewide in Minnesota, which has not then happened since 2006. Is Jason Lewis the Republican who's going to break that streak?
Well, it's hard, right? And, you know, Governor Pawlenty won in 2006. That was a strong Democratic year. I mean, that was the midterm of George W. Bush's second term as president. And if you recall, there was a thing happening at the time called the Iraq War that wasn't terribly popular. So Republicans were not really doing hot in 2006. And Tim Pawlenty managed to get reelected, you know, really in an uphill battle, even as an incumbent in 2006. And like you say, was the last statewide Republican elected in Minnesota. I think for Jason Lewis to do that, Trump is going to have to come very close to winning the state like he did last time. But again, without those, you know, without the benefit of that third party vote or those people staying at home. So Jason needs Trump to be right there neck and neck. And then he needs to just have that little extra increment of voters that know who he is from when he was a radio talk show host, when he was a one-term congressman in the 2nd Congressional District, and just have enough to push him over the top. So, you know, he got elected to Congress when President Trump was running 4 years ago. And so I think he's looking at it from that same vein, like, okay, I pulled it off 4 years ago. People didn't think I was going to win that race. And so now I'm going to try to replicate that statewide. So I think it's a, you know, you're relying on factors outside of your own control if you try to run a race like that. I think they are counting on northern Minnesota to come out really strongly for the president and for Jason Lewis. If you go up there, Jason Lewis has lawn signs and billboards of himself, you know, standing next to President Trump. So he's like literally tying himself to President Trump in his advertising. And that's his play. You know, for me, I think that's a risky play, but like if that's the shot that you've got, you know, then take it.
So help me out with this, Brian. What happened here in the sense that, again, you know, Tim Pawlenty, we could spend a whole show on Tim Pawlenty having various chapters of his political career. But, you know, he is the last sort of statewide elected Republican, as you mentioned, winning in a very challenging year, was not a Trumpy kind of Republican. Like, there weren't Trumpy Republicans quite the way there are now. Maybe Michelle Bachmann. Anyway, but it really seems like now most of the party here in Minnesota is like, nope, we are very Trumpy Republicans. I'm Jason Lewis. I'm, as you said, going to put a billboard up with me and Trump. Why does that seem like that's going to be the winning strategy versus the kind of strategy I think that we remember from a Tim Pawlenty of, no, I'm going to make overtures towards more suburban Sam's Club type Republicans and people like that?
Yeah, well, I mean, keep in mind that Minnesota went 20 years without a Democratic governor.
Yeah. Right?
Between Arnie Carlson, Jesse Ventura, and Tim Pawlenty, we had 2 decades of non-DFL control of the governor's office. And now we've had back-to-back DFL governors, and we haven't had a statewide Republican elected in 14 years. So I think what's happening right now is, I don't even know that it's so much a strategy of the elected, you know, these Republican candidates to get to win an election, but it's what they're hearing from the base and from their activists. And in Minnesota, that's how we pick our candidates, right? Our candidates are largely chosen by people that show up at caucuses. So you have to, on a Tuesday night in, February or March, go to a church or a junior high or a community center and, sit with your neighbors for 2 or 3 hours and debate a party platform, and then maybe get elected delegate to the next thing and the next thing, and spend like 3 or 4 Saturdays doing this. But those are the people that are choosing our candidates. And the people that are willing to be part of that process, they have really strong beliefs, and they are there for a reason, and they tend to be on the extremes, both on the right and on the left. And so that's, I think, what we're seeing. The candidates reflect the people who show up, because, life is about showing up, who gets involved. And I think that's where we are right now in our politics, maybe especially on the Republican side, but I think on the DFL side as well.
Is that fair on the DFL side, Grace? I mean, I'll say I live in South Minneapolis, and a lot of my friends would say, oh no, I wish that we had a senator who was much more like Elizabeth Warren than was like an Amy Klobuchar or Tina Smith.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just impossible to overgeneralize anything. In either party, there are the kind of way more far right Republicans, there are way more far left Democrats, and there's just no way that I think it's unproductive to kind of just cast a general swath across both of them. And I think something that is particular to the last 4 years, and even just thinking about how things would change, I know we're talking about things at the local level, but if things were to change in a Biden presidency, I think President Trump has certainly tapped into something in the American psyche over the next 4 years, but he didn't create all the divisions that we're seeing. I think has certainly made it more acceptable for people to be open about it, but these are things that were here all along. So I think just the way that people are approaching and engaging in politics in the last 4 years is completely different. So I'm personally looking forward to seeing how that would hopefully change in the Biden administration. But yeah, I think the rhetoric in the last 4 years is just completely different from what we've been seeing in the past. And I don't know, that's not going to change overnight, certainly, but I do wonder if that will change with a different tone at the top of the national level.
Crystal ball question in terms of presuming Tina Smith is reelected. She has spent her entire time as a senator so far running for election, basically. Assuming she wins this November, she'll kind of for the first time be able to just be a senator for a few years in theory. What does she do? What does her profile look like at that point? Is she sort of a quieter, a little bit maybe just like goes and does the work senator that we don't hear much about, or does she start to take a higher profile in something? Grace?
I think her personality has always been, it's how she approached being lieutenant governor as well. I mean, she is a workhorse, and she has that nickname of the Velvet Hammer, which I've seen in my own experience working for her is absolutely true. And I think, people don't give her enough credit for, how like fiery she can be sometimes. Like, she is hilarious and can give some really raucous, firing speeches when she wants to. But I think Minnesotans appreciate a senator that is really going to work for them. I think it's part of why Amy Klobuchar has been so popular and has won by just impressive margins in every race that she has run. But yes, I think having a full 6-year term will allow Senator Smith to really be able to define herself in a way that has been basically impossible for her to do in the last 2 years, because so much of the narrative had just been created for her. But just knowing her personally and what her style is, I imagine she will kind of stick more in the workhorse category, but I still don't think that means that people can't still be inspired by her.
I'm going to throw a different crystal ball one to you, because you brought up Amy Klobuchar, Grace. Brian, crystal ball, Attorney General Amy Klobuchar?
Yeah, right. I mean, I was going to go there whether or not you asked me that question. So, crystal ball, Joe Biden gets elected president. Does Amy Klobuchar end up in the cabinet? I think Amy Klobuchar's endorsement of Joe Biden was one of the more significant endorsements at that level that we've seen in a long time. I mean, that was really something, right? Like, most times like, oh, you endorse somebody, you know, whatever. Like she endorsed him and then he wins Minnesota. And, you know, that Minnesota primary, I think, was up for grabs. And, you know, Bernie Sanders had won the caucuses 4 years before. So that, I think she really delivered for Biden. And I think, you know, she and her team will remind him of that should he be elected president. So, yeah, I don't know if it's attorney general or another position in the cabinet, but I think she's likely to get significant consideration. Of course, if that happens, then Senator Smith is the senior senator. And then Governor Walz has an opportunity to appoint somebody to the Senate for, you know, again, another then special election in 2 years to fill out the remainder of this current 6-year term. So we could be back in that game of musical chairs. You know, then does the Republican who's the president of the Minnesota Senate become the lieutenant governor, or right, depends on who controls the Senate at that time. So there's all right, like there's all that weirdness. Are you imagining
that Governor Walz appoints like a Peggy Flanagan?
Yeah, that's my musical chair theory, right? Because I always say that Minnesota politics is weird, so I want to take the weirdest possible option. Not, I mean, she's fine, but like in terms of like the cascading impact of what would happen next. That, you know, as we saw. When, you know, Senator Smith was first elevated, and then Senator Fischbach was, you know, Senator Fischbach and Lieutenant Governor Fischbach at the same time, or not, depending on who you ask, you know, on which day. So yeah, I could see that as a possible outcome if, you know, all of those dominoes fall.
Is that your pick, Grace? We're really way out in the crystal ball here, but it's fun. So Senator Klobuchar joins the cabinet. Governor Walz gets to make a pick. Who's your pick?
Man, I can't even like wrap my mind around that at one point, but I do feel confident that Democrats, I think, have an incredibly deep bench. So I think that if this happens, the governor is going to have no shortage of incredible options. I certainly hope that it would still be a woman, and I think there is no shortage of incredible women that he could appoint.
Okay, we got a question here that's come into me. It's a dark question, but it feels fair to ask. In Minnesota, we had a death before an election when Senator Wellstone died in a plane crash relatively shortly before the actual vote. In the sort of story of that series of events, there was a lot of talk about whether people got to be too political and too partisan following that death, particularly at Senator Wellstone's funeral. So the question here, in thinking about President Trump being diagnosed, and obviously in no way foreshadowing anything that is actually going to happen with his health, but even with where we are right now with just him being diagnosed, could we be in for a repeat of the Wellstone funeral effect if Dem supporters basically get too gleeful about President Trump being diagnosed with COVID-19? Brian, I'll start with you.
Yeah, yes, I think there is the possibility that Democrats, you know, look like they are happy about the president's illness, you know, or somehow, you know, too snarky about that. So I think, you know, that tone is really important. The words that they use right now are really important. I mean, Vice President Biden put out a statement on Twitter like that, you know, that they're thinking of and praying for the president and the first lady. Like, that's appropriate. That's the way they should handle it. But there will be some that won't be able to help themselves. So I think it is important for Democrats to be careful about that. I think it's very different from Senator Wellstone's tragic accident in the sense that in that case, there was, you know, this memorial service at Williams Arena that the whole state was watching. Everyone in Minnesota was watching that when it was happening. And the sense that that event became political and was, you know, took an inappropriate turn, I think became really widespread amongst Minnesotans. And I recall myself door knocking in 2002, and everybody paused for, you know, several days and didn't campaign until after that event at Williams Arena. And then when you went back out and started knocking on doors, the thing that people wanted to talk to you about was what had happened at the memorial. So events like that can really impact a race. I think this is different. I don't see, there's not going to be like one moment that everybody's watching and says, well, that wasn't the right way to handle it. But it's still important to be careful.
Grace, how do you feel about this? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think the way that Democrats have been approaching this pandemic, which I think is like really coming from a place of compassion, and we need to be looking out for all of us, for our own health and safety, for the health and safety of our family members. I think that needs to be how we continue to message it. And I hope that, because this pandemic is not going away, and I think the front story on the paper this morning put it kind of perfectly, like the president, with all of the health precautions and with all of the tools that the White House had in order to keep him safe, he still got sick. So I hope that this becomes a moment where we kind of hit reset on the pandemic a little bit, and people can kind of come to realize that any of us can get sick, any of our family members can get sick. And it's unfortunate that it has taken, the president of the United States getting sick for this to happen. But I hope that we can all just use this time to really be thinking about how we can care better for each other.
Okay, I have a bunch more to get through, and we're more than halfway through this event. So I'm going to keep moving down to congressional races. 2 years ago, Minnesota, as you mentioned, Brian, Minnesota always does something weird. We flipped 4 seats. We had 2 go from Democrats to Republicans and 2 go from Republicans to Democrats. This time around, there are obviously all of the Congress people are up for re-election. The one that I heard, I was reading The Economist because I like to get all my Minnesota news from a British publication.
Yeah, the UK, that's it.
Yeah, exactly. But they specifically called out that basically the only Democratic seat in the country that they are really watching to potentially go from Democrat to Republican is Colin Peterson in Minnesota's 7th district. So I'm going to kind of just throw this open to you. I'll start with you. Grace, is Colin Peterson, after 2 decades flying around the giant 7th district, is this the end of the road?
I mean, for one, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I'm going to plug another reminder for the census, because as we were saying earlier, the 7th district could cease to exist at some point in the next couple of years. But I think Colin Peterson has always been a very unique Democrat. I mean, if you think of, we were talking about Minnesota kind of being the center of the world, Minnesota's congressional delegation is sort of a microcosm. I mean, we have Ilhan Omar and Colin Peterson, both in our Democratic Party. So I think he has been representing the interests of the 7th district well and matches that district well. Obviously, this is a more competitive race than we have seen than in recent years. But I still think that ultimately he is going to be the best person for the 7th district.
Colin Peterson, only Democrat to vote against impeachment in the House. I'll also just throw out there, in terms of Colin Peterson actually representing his district on the issues, he's the chair of the Agriculture Committee, which once upon a time would matter a lot to people, I think, in the 7th district. But
yeah, and I think that's a major thing to keep in mind. And that's why I always find the tactic of really trying to link him to Nancy Pelosi a bit bizarre, because like you said, Tane, he did vote against impeachment, which really irritated a lot of Democrats. But I think ideologically wise matched what his district was probably looking for him to do.
Brian?
I mean, what you guys said is Colin's TV ad, right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm the chair of the Agriculture Committee. I voted against Trump. I mean, or voted against impeachment. Really odd to have a Democrat running an ad saying, I voted against impeaching President Trump. But nevertheless, here we are. Trump won the district by 30 points. So here's the thing. Colin Peterson is in serious trouble, and he's in serious trouble because that district is coming home. And that the people in that district are just reverting to party line voting, which is what we're seeing across the country and in Minnesota. People are not ticket splitting as much as they used to, even in our state. And so the same thing that happened to Jim Oberstar in the 8th Congressional District is what is happening to Colin Peterson. And everybody said, Jim Oberstar will never lose. Jim Oberstar is the son of the Iron Range. Jim Oberstar is chair of the Transportation Committee, right? Same thing, he brings it home for us. Well, he lost. So I think that's what's happening now. Colin's been there for 30 years. He's had a good run. He was too stubborn to ever retire. right? I mean, what would happen every 2 years is he would like kind of hint that he was retiring, and then like the NRCC would start poking him, and then he'd be like, well, I'm not going to let them push me out. So he wouldn't retire. So that's what's happening. And I think Michelle Fischbach is going to beat him. I mean, that's my crystal ball. Is I just think there's too many Republican votes up there and too many Trump votes that it's not possible for Colin Peterson in this election to overcome that top of the ballot pressure.
We could talk again about a lot of these. The weird one again this time around is Angie Craig. There was a Legal Marijuana Party Now candidate who tragically passed away, which triggered a Minnesota law that says, okay, we're not going to do this election in November for the 2nd Congressional District. We are going to push it out till February. Angie Craig is challenging that in court. I'm curious, this is my crystal ball question to kind of cut to the chase. If you're Angie Craig or her Republican challenger, do you want to do that election in November, or would you rather do it in February? I think we know what Angie Craig wants, but what does that shake out as? Grace?
I mean, I think what we have to keep in mind too, if the election does not happen in November, then that means the 2nd Congressional District will have no representation for the month of January. And I think we can all agree that the month of January is going to be an incredibly busy month in this country. So I think that is a real thing that people need to think about, and I would personally be concerned about. And I'm also concerned about what, Trump won this district by like 1.19% in 2016. So it's a really, really competitive district. And if a competitive district if this race is not on the ballot, what is that going to do to the other races on the ballot? I think we run the risk of affecting turnout in these other races. I think encouraging people to come out and vote in a special election, particularly, I'm exhausted by this election. I think a lot of people are just going to be tired and relieved when this election is over. And I think it's going to be a big lift to get the kind of turnout that we usually like to see in elections in February. So,
yeah. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, two really weird potential things to think about here. Number one is if the Electoral College is a tie, 269, then of course the election goes to the House of Representatives. Then the delegations vote by state, right? So each delegation gathers and then they cast one vote for president. So somebody has to get 26 states with a majority to be elected president. Now imagine that when that's happening, we don't have somebody representing Minnesota too. So now we're down to 7 members instead of 8. Then that makes the Colin Peterson, Michelle Fischbach race the deciding vote for Minnesota's congressional delegation if they are voting to cast their vote for president if the Electoral College is tied. So that's like if everything is totally insane, that makes the fact that we have an open seat in MN2 makes that Fischbach-Peterson race all the more important there. So that's bonkers. And then secondly, I think it's really interesting, Angie Craig is suing to try to keep the election on for November. The state law is very clear. It was passed in 2013 when there was all Democratic control of the Minnesota legislature and the governor. So they did that, as a response to Senator Wellstone's death and the scramble that happened then. So it's understandable to try to have a mechanism if one of the candidates dies on how you're going to handle that. I just don't know if this is the best way to do it. If this is what we would, if we were going to do that again, if that's what we want. However, Secretary of State Steve Simon knew right away what the law said, what it was going to be, in part because he wrote the law. So he was a state representative who wrote that law in 2013. So I think he knows what it says. It's just a question of, is that in conflict with the Constitution that says you will have elections for federal offices in November? So we'll see how that pans out. I don't know if it's going to affect turnout too much, right? Because our people are turning out because of the presidential race or because of, whatever reasons they have to turn out. Minnesota too has pretty high turnout overall on whole. That's where I live, and people are, politically active. So I'm just telling people, vote for it anyway, because you don't know what the courts are going to say. And then if we get to vote again in February, you get another shot at it.
Okay, I got to get down to, since we already brought it up, Minnesota legislative level. The entire Minnesota legislature, Senate and House, are up for election this year. I will say, it seems to me like Democrats are putting a lot of chips on the idea that they will have full control of the Minnesota legislature going forward, that they'll win back the Senate and keep the House and have the governorship. I don't know if I don't know if you want a crystal ball, whether that is likely or not, and I'll ask either of you. But then also, I'm just curious about what is it that the legislature with a Governor Walz in the next 2 years does or wants to do, depending on what it looks like. Brian, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the Minnesota Senate is a question mark. You know, Republicans, of course, have a 2-seat majority in the Senate right now, and there are a couple of seats that I think Republicans, that are in jeopardy, right? So Paul Anderson had a seat in the northwestern suburbs that he won in a very close race 4 years ago, and he's not running again. I think that district is hard to hold. On the flip side, there's a district in Lakeville where Matt Little is the senator that has 2 Republican representatives inside of that Senate district, and I think Republicans could win that seat. Likewise, those greater Minnesota districts where Trump is going to win with 25, 30% of the vote in some places, I think Senator Dan Sparks in Austin is in serious trouble for that down ballot effect that's going to happen. He's been winning even as Republicans have done better and better in that area. And so I think they could pick up a seat there. So I think Republicans in the Minnesota Senate have a fighting chance at maintaining their majority. I think it's still going to be a very tight majority, a very close one, but I could see that. Republicans in the Minnesota House feel really good about their opportunity to take over control of the Minnesota House. Even with kind of the overall, cross currents, they look at the races and they need to pick up, I think it is 9 seats to take control of the Minnesota House. And they've got 2 Republican races that are suburban races, that are open seats where they have former representatives running, Roz Peterson and Pam Myra. So those are 2 good pickups for them in the suburbs. They've got some greater Minnesota seats, like one in Bemidji, that they barely lost last time, that they think they can win back. So Republicans are looking at their polling and saying, we feel really good about our chances there. So that's another, Minnesota has weird politics. So, right, Joe Biden could win the state, but Republicans could maintain control of the Senate and take control of the Minnesota House. And then you have a lot that happens between the legislature and Walz, because they have total control of the legislature, and they will vote to take away his executive authority on the peacetime state of emergency. They will really pressure him on a whole host of issues if they have both the House and Senate. If it stays the way it is, it's still this kind of 2-on-1 dynamic. And so you have a bit of a stalemate on things. But if either party gets full control of the legislature, then things move a lot.
Grace, are Democrats putting too much on the line in the idea of we're going to win the whole thing? And B, if they do win the whole thing, what do they want to do?
So no, I don't think they're putting too much on it. I think we have a really strong chance of maintaining the House, and we only need to win 2 seats to take the Senate. And I think that is completely feasible. And then we get to, I think we owe, for one, a huge debt of gratitude to Governor Walz and how he's been handling this pandemic response. And I think we could have been going a lot further with our response were it not for Senate Republicans really battling him every step of the way. So I think if you have full DFL control of House and Senate, then that opens the door for us to really get going still on our pandemic response, because this pandemic is not going away anytime soon, and really get moving on the economic recovery piece, particularly disaster relief, which unfortunately has not come up in any of these special sessions. And I think really when we're looking ahead to a budget year with a massive deficit, we really only need to look back to Governor Mark Dayton with full DFL control and what they were able to do to balance that budget. So I'm feeling optimistic about it.
Okay, I've only got time for one more question, and this one feels, again, like every hour the news changes radically. And yet behind or in front of, depending on how you're looking at this, everything is this question of race and racial injustice that really ignited the whole country, starting here in Minneapolis this year. Again, in looking forward and trying to kind of crystal ball this, are there things that you foresee the Minnesota legislature potentially doing in that space, whether on policing reform or on economic opportunity or X, Y, and Z? And B, does that sort of stay a big part of our conversation and our politics going forward? And I apologize to Christine for slipping in 2 questions when she said I only had time for 1. Grace, I'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is absolutely something that we need to, an issue that we just need to sit in for a while. Like, there was obviously a lot of energy around this issue over the summer with George Floyd, and I think it's unfortunate that in some ways it feels like we have moved on from that, particularly when we are thinking about like the public safety issue. And I really think we need to kind of revert back into thinking this was not a brand new issue with George Floyd. It's systemic racism going back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And that is not an issue that is going to be solved in 1 year or one legislative session or with a couple of roundtables or meetings. This is something that I think we all need to dedicate ourselves to spending some real time on. And it's going to be really difficult and unpleasant for a lot of people, but I think we are at this really, really unique moment in time where there is a lot of energy around having this conversation, and we absolutely need to keep that going.
Yeah, and Tane, first of all, thank you to you and the Theater of Public Policy for the work that you're doing around your uncomfortable conversations and work on anti-racism. That's really important. So I encourage all of you to check out what the T2P2 is doing in that area. It is really important, like Drake said, to keep the conversation going. I think the good news is that we've had bipartisan support for criminal justice reforms. So things like drug sentencing reform and probation reform. And I think we need to continue the momentum on that. So there are Republicans that get this and want to work on this issue. And I think we need to continue to encourage them and Democrats to come together and to keep these issues front and center. And like Grace was saying, keep ourselves grounded in the way that we felt in late May after the murder of George Floyd, to remind ourselves that this is a real problem in Minnesota. I think Minnesotans have had a way of convincing ourselves that like, well, we're not like that. We're Minnesotans. We're nice to everybody. We take care of each other. And like, let's be real. Like, there is racism in our state. It is here. It is embedded. It is deep. And we have to face it and deal with it and work together on that. And I've seen some positive glimmers of hope even at the legislature on issues like policing and criminal justice reform, and I think we can keep progress going on that.
Well, with that, that is probably, I'll say, the most important, I think, thing that we've talked about in some ways today, because it is an issue that affects all of us, I really believe, and is absolutely something that has and should be sort of front of mind in how we think about almost all these